water loop.
Welcome to Waterloop, the podcast that explores solutions for sustainability and equity in water. I'm Travis Loop, co-host for this episode.
And I'm co-host Maya Richard Craven. This episode is part of the Color of Water series, which features interviews with diverse experts from communities across the country. This series is a collaboration between Waterloop and the Water Hub.
This is episode number 223, Empowering Oregon to Achieve Water Justice. Many people in Oregon face significant water justice challenges, including affordability, accessibility, and quality. Addressing these issues requires place-based, community-specific solutions. In this episode, Alai Reyes-Santos, Associate Director of the PNW Just Futures Institute for Climate and Racial Justice, discusses her work in Oregon and what she has learned from her roots in Puerto Rico. She explains the diverse water justice issues in Oregon, such as distrust of water quality among communities of color, inadequate infrastructure in tribal areas, and the vulnerabilities of renters. Alai also highlights the efforts to build a water justice network and a water justice leadership institute, aiming to empower communities and advocate for equitable water policies.
You're in the water loop.
Alai, we are so happy to have you on as part of our Color of Water series. From the prep call that Maya and I did with you, we know there is so much information for you to share about what's happening in Oregon and your background and connection to Puerto Rico. So very excited. Let's kind of look at the broad picture of water justice in Oregon. What's happening there in the state? What are the challenges?
Yes, thank you so much for asking that. So, water justice in Oregon and anywhere is actually very place-based, community-based. The issues that people face are very specific to according to the regulations that water is under, where in their communities. What are the kinds of utilities you have? Do you have a small water system? Do you have, are you part of a kind of municipal system? Do you have well water? And also, what are the kind of culturally specific ways in which communities engage with water? And so, for example, I'll share a few cases of what's happening in Oregon on water justice so you see the diversity of the work that needs to happen. So on one hand, we have questions of water affordability, and that's something that across the nation is an issue. We don't tend to have any kind of support for people to cover their water bills if they have trouble, if they lose their job, for example. Here in Oregon, in our interviews, we were able to talk with people about, so do you have help with your water bill if you cannot pay it? And the only place where people knew about a program that would help them with water affordability issues was in Eugene, Oregon, with one of the utilities here. And people raved about it, which was amazing. They're like, yes, I was in trouble. I was sick. I couldn't pay my water bill. And they helped me. And there was no need to pay for interest, no penalties. They just supported me in that moment. But besides them, that was it, right? And we're talking about communities that sometimes are paying their bill and are also buying bottled water. Because something we learned is that communities do not trust the water they drink, right? Even if it's coming from a municipal utility, especially the communities of color we talk to, actually have deep distrust of their water, whether because they do not know where it comes from or how it's treated, or because it literally smells or looks weird, or they've actually had health impacts from the water quality in their faucet. And so you have people who oftentimes are low income, are renting, are vulnerable, and suddenly they're paying their water bill, doing their best to pay their bill, even in really distressful situations, and are also buying bottled water to drink, right? So the question of water affordability across the board became a really crucial one. And when we talk to people, we actually talked to a Somali immigrant in Eastern Oregon who rations how much water she drinks in her home, just because she cannot afford to pay her bill and also to buy bottled water to drink. We also have, for example, a significant number of indigenous Mesoamerican communities from Guatemala and from Mexico who speak multiple languages, not only Spanish, right? They actually have their own indigenous languages, and who in farm work, when they do farm work or in canneries, do not trust the water at work, whether because they know there are real issues with the water, or because they don't have information about it, right? And they are concerned about pollution and toxics in the water from their same workplace where they find themselves. And so you see them bringing this one bottle of water every day that lasts through the whole workday, right? Like 8 hours of work, sometimes under the sun, with one bottle of water, because the water that they trust. And so that's one of the issues we've seen. We've also seen in farm worker housing, like questions of, is the well going dry in the summer? And then water has to be brought in. And that's happening across the state, actually, because of climate change. Well water is not actually replenishing in the winter like it used to. So wells are going dry. And you have to be able to afford paying for a truck to come to your house to bring you water, unless your county is somehow providing that for you, which some counties are now activating themselves to do that work. We're also talking about Black communities who are also distrustful of their water sources and who don't have information about water quality treatment, so on and so forth, and they want to have it, but they don't have it. Renters became actually, I don't think those of us doing this work at the beginning knew how vulnerable renters are. Even those of us who were renting at the time were still renting. We didn't even know what information we were not getting as renters. So, for example, we had algae blooms impact Salem a few years ago, but actually happens in other parts of the state too. Low-income communities, renters, and indigenous Mesoamerican immigrants actually were the last or never heard about the fact that their water wasn't safe to drink in their faucet for days. And some of them thought, oh, if I boil it, it's going to be better. But actually, it makes it worse with algae blooms. It actually makes it more toxic for your body. So those are some of those kind of challenges that we face with water justice, with those communities. And then, of course, we have tribes who keep fighting for their water rights, for basic just water needs. Warm Springs tribe has been in a water crisis for years, where every summer, actually, people bring water for people to be able to have clean water to drink to the tribe. We're talking about water infrastructure issues in tribal systems, like in Klamath, where there's wooden pipes still, right, like from the 40s, are used to carry water to people's homes. We're talking about salmon and chawam and other lamprey eel, important food staples in indigenous diets that are actually disappearing, being endangered, not accessible, or polluted, and therefore impacting tribes' capacity to sustain their food sources and also just their communities, not to mention their own cultural practices. So those are all some examples of those really specific kinds of water justice challenges we face. But again, we have to go place-based and community-specific to get to the details of those.
So thank you for that answer. I was wondering, what is the vision for water justice in Oregon?
Well, right now, so we've been doing engagement now for 5 years, which is amazing. We began doing one-on-one interviews, focus groups, community meetings on Zoom during the pandemic or on the phone. And now my colleagues at Coalition of Communities of Color, Verde, Willamette Partnership, have all envisioned this water justice network that brings together historically underserved communities in the water sector. So we just had our retreat at University of Oregon. It was the most beautiful, diverse group of people, tribal members, Black community leaders, a significant amount of Latinx community members who are environmental justice leaders, indigenous Mesoamerican communities, Asian American community leaders, and also white identified allies as well, working with low-income communities, with renters, communities of color. And so, like, part of that vision for water justice is that building of that network, of that water justice network, that a community of people who get to advocate, to work together and collaborate on projects. That was in response to the engagement work we did, because people said, we want to advocate for water. We want to steward water. We all have, no matter where we are from, we all have a culturally specific commitment to the health of water and why it matters. That was across the board something that everyone agreed. What people said is, we just do not know how to advocate about it here, right, in this particular place, whether people had grown up here or not. People had zero information even about how a treatment plant works, like nothing, how sewage works. And so the Water Justice Network emerged as a space to build that capacity, to share experiences from all the communities, and to create space of shared advocacy in the legislative work and policymaking world, and also storytelling to educate people about what's happening across the state. The other part of that water justice work is this beautiful project called the Water Justice Leadership Institute that's led by Verde, which is an urban, people of color, low-income people-led organization in Portland. And that was in response to people's desire to learn and advocate. They have these cohorts where people meet and talk about well water, groundwater, utilities, lawn policy, and they come up each one with a project at the end about water in their community that they wish to pursue. And so through these two entities, we've seen water justice emerge as a very diverse field of work and advocacy, which wasn't the case before. But also we've been impacting legislation, like literally since 2021, there's been work on water in Salem and also in Congress, where community members who are part of the network, who are part of these leadership institutes, are actually impacting directly or sharing their stories to be passed down to legislators to impact policy on drought packages, for example, water infrastructure investments. We just got 1.5 million to give directly to University of Oregon and Portland State University to EJ communities, environmental justice communities, and tribes to do water projects in their communities in their own culturally specific way, however they want to do them, using their own expertise and knowledge about their community to implement those projects. None of that has ever been done before, neither in Oregon or elsewhere, where state money is going directly to environmental justice communities and tribes to do that work in this particular way. And tribal governments have, in their negotiations as sovereign nations, of course, have access to some resources, but this is a particular way of funding it as well and supporting them in their work. That's about, here's the funding and use it as you wish, no strings attached, right? So those are all some of the kinds of areas in which we're impacting the work in Oregon now. And also through the water justice policy framework as well, which is a number of priorities that emerge out of all this engagement and work to lead the work in Oregon, but also that we're sharing across the nation. And we also just got to present in Brazil with Indigenous and Black communities in Brazil who are really interested in this way of doing the work. I can expand more on any of these if you
I think we do have some follow-up questions here with all of that you have going on. That's incredible. One thing you mentioned is kind of talking to people, talking to communities, doing some outreach. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Like kind of how you, I guess, polled people and what you asked them, and a little bit more about what they kind of the findings, what they said back to you?
One of the really powerful pieces of the work has been that we believe, all of us who worked on it, and I want to say that I'm just one of many. It's been a really powerful collaborative process of co-creation and co-design. And so in the first stage, for example, we were partnering with Chinook Indian Nation, with NWCP, with Unite Oregon, which is at the time was working with immigrants and refugees from all over the world. PECUN, who works with Indigenous Mesoamerican farm workers, and also Yuval Cree, who also works with Indigenous Mesoamerican and Latinx communities in Eastern Oregon. And so how we developed an engagement practice that was co-designed with other communities. So if a community said, for example, at first we had these in-person meetings with food and childcare, and of course, linguistic interpretation. The pandemic hit, we're like, oh, we have to pivot. So, okay, so PECUN, how do you think it would be best to engage people over the phone? Right now, Zoom is not something that's accessible for our community. We have a digital divide, but you can call people and they will talk to you. And so we had half-hour phone calls in Spanish with most people actually at that time. And we would ask, how do you grow up with water? What do you learn from your parents about water? What do you know about water in Oregon? So for example, when we work with PECUN, then we talk to people on the phone. Then with Chinook Indian Nation, they were like, oh, we're having Zoom meetings to keep the community connected in the pandemic. We went to a Zoom meeting, co-facilitated with them. With Unite Oregon, they also were doing Zoom meetings to keep communities connected with each other. So people were used to it, and they're also more based in urban areas. And we had 4 languages interpretation at the same time on Zoom and WhatsApp to make it accessible for people who spoke different languages. So basically, our approach has always been, how is it more accessible for your community to participate? We will then work with that accessibility. We will also co-design the questions with you so that they're actually important to your community members. We'll do some research in that process and support that co-design process. And also we'll have interviews or questions that are about a conversation, a human relationship with people that's not about, let me extract information from you. And that's all that matters here. I actually wanted to know how people were doing, right? And also in the middle of the pandemic, really horrendous wildfires in Oregon, really horrible ice storms, you know? I mean, our weather is really changing and impacting people in really deep ways. Also, it became a way, for example, talking with Native American elders, like at that time, who were really alone and isolated because in the pandemic, they hadn't seen people for months. This phone call was the one time they had to talk with someone. And so just having a conversation and then talking about water in that process. And what was powerful about it is that at the beginning, many people would tell us, I don't know anything about water, because we have all this lingo and jargon, water infrastructure, utilities, blah, blah, blah. And then even state agencies do not understand each other. They use different language with each other about water. But then we were just asking, what about water at work? Do you drink it? How does it feel? Can you afford your bill? How does it feel to pay your bill? And people feel like, oh, I know a lot about water, because we all have a lived experience of water. So for us, the community engagement had to center people's water expertise and seeing people not as just consumers of water, which is usually how they're approached, but as water actors, water experts who have something to say about how water is actually behaving and being stewarded in their communities.
What is the framework for addressing the challenges?
So we're super excited to be talking about the framework right now after all this work. So the framework has these particular kind of priorities. The first one is Indigenous water justice leadership has to be supported and prioritized in any policy work, investments in water, because who knows better how to care for water resources than the people who've always been here. And so that is really key to the work. One part of that work has been supporting cultural fires by tribes in the Pacific Northwest. Cultural fires have become a really key component of avoiding and preventing big wildfires, dangerous wildfires. That was always the case before they were prohibited by law and policy. But also they're essential for cooling water resources and making sure that actually when rain falls, creates little pools of water, cultural fires like the ash and all that's produced by them protects that water from just evaporating quickly, right? And it allows it to go to the groundwater, feed wells, but also make it all the way to creeks and rivers too. So that has been one of the key components of Indigenous water justice leadership that we've been trying to advocate for and protect, because it is really hard for tribes to actually conduct their cultural fires, essential for water health and food staples too. A second item has been renters' rights, and this actually seems to, we hope, be a really key component of work next year in legislative and policy-making processes. We have made it very clear that renters are one of the most vulnerable communities when it comes to water justice issues. We talked to people who said, I had to move because there was actually toxic elements coming through the water and they made my child sick, right? And they had no way to advocate for themselves as renters when that happened. They just had to move, right? And there was no way for that to be repaired for the next renter who came. So renters has become a key area of advocacy as well. Water access and affordability. Again, the question of how is it that people are supported, they cannot pay their water bill is really important. It's interesting, we have quite a bit of support for energy affordability more than for water. And so we're trying to call attention to that. And also what it means to support people who are well water and who have their wells, that are really old, that are not working well, that are not safe. How do you afford to repair it, to replace it? It's really expensive. How do you afford to test it? Do you know that you can test it at home too? Test some of the toxics really easy at home. So we've been doing actually pilot projects and also supporting existing now funds that are being made available to actually support people to repair their wells or replace them, but mostly for homeowners and not for people who rent or people who rent their homes to somebody else. So we're trying to push that piece of renters and people who rent their homes to other people should also receive support for that. That's a water affordability issue for sure. Natural and built infrastructure for clean water. So we're talking about the fact that the US actually has not invested in 40, 50 years in a real way in water infrastructures, in our plumbing systems, in schools, right? Like where we have people who get lead poisoning in schools. And so these are all things that are actually impacting communities in Oregon as well, but also natural infrastructure. How do we make sure that there's clean, cool water in our rivers, in our creeks, so that fish, plant life can actually survive? When water gets too hot, things just die, literally die, right? So that will impact also our human health as well. And that's something that when we talked to Grand Run Tribal Natural Resources Department, they said, please keep telling people we need clean, cool water. Hot water actually impacts tribal food capacity and also our cultural resources in deep ways, but actually everyone's. Emergency preparedness. Everyone we talk to, right? I think we talked directly with around 200 people and indirectly with so many more, terrified when we had wildfires, having no information, not knowing, like, if they had to evacuate, where do I go? How can I afford to take my family with me? I do not have a car. What's the transportation available? How do I prepare my house during an emergency? Wildfires, flooding, ice storms. Everyone across the board was like, they actually shared with us, we were so scared and had no way to know how to prepare ourselves, respond, or resources to react. So that's being now a really important piece of work that we're doing. Accessible, multilingual access to resources about emergencies, trauma-informed, and also just literally resources for people to be safe. And that's some of the work that I think is happening with resiliency hubs, not only in Oregon, but other places too. I think that's one of those investments that are coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act in Congress. And lastly, the most important, community empowerment. We keep talking to people about how people having information is community empowerment. People having education about their water resources and stewardship that's culturally specific, that engages their own knowledge too, is community empowerment. People being able to go and know where to go and advocate and who they can talk to when there's an issue about water in their community empowerment. And also that when state agencies, utilities, and others want to do engagement and consulting, those are the words that are used, it has to impact decision making. And it has to be done in a way that's accessible, that is not like a whole day, 8 to 5 on a work day, when people have to go to work and they cannot participate. Or they participate and then they never see the results of what they said anywhere, right? They were used as just a stamp to say, we talked to them, but then we did exactly what we had planned in the first place. And so for us, community empowerment means all of those items as well. And linguistic justice emerged as one of the biggest pieces. How do we have linguistic justice and access for all as well?
That is an incredible amount of work that you have going on. You've mentioned, a number of times these different organizations that are involved. How do you build that network? How do you put that all together and coordinate it?
I'm going to be totally transparent right now. That was, when the idea for this began, it was me and Stacy Dalgard, who used to work at Oregon Environmental Council. We just had coffee, and she said, the governor's, Kay Brown at the time, wants to do something on Oregon's water vision for the future. And we said, rural communities, low-income communities, communities of color have to be present in that work. We have to, do something that makes that happen. It was just the two of us with an idea in a coffee shop. And then Stacy began to reach out to people. And I remember being a bit scared. I was like, this is getting big really fast, really quickly. Um, because I just had never seen anything like this being done here in Oregon. I had done it in California back in the day, but not here. And I would say that the way that it was possible, it was by reaching out to people, one, making sure that people knew they would have economic resources to do the work. So, okay, so we're going to invite you and we're going to apply for grants to make sure that everyone is remunerated, especially people who are in communities that are understaffed, underserved, doing free labor half the time. They need to be remunerated. So that was a key component of showing people this is how much we can offer, right? Like through granting and so on and so forth, to make sure people's time is remunerated. The second thing was going with our hearts. We all care about water in this heart-based way. It's important. It's a living being. We know it's essential for life. So let's do the work from that place. And with the capacity that we all have, we'll never burn each other out, trying to do more than we can hold. And I would say the last one is with the clear awareness that we were all very different from each other, and we continue to be. That when we come together, we're all coming from very specific places and culturally specific backgrounds and economic status and racial identities and sexual and religious identities. And so just being aware of that difference instead of denying it and actually putting that difference at the center of the work. So that no one feels like, oh, I have to become somebody else to do the work with you, but rather I get to be my whole being to do the work with you. And I get to say I'm having surgery and I cannot go. And that's okay, right? Like to be held in a whole way as human beings. For us, that's part of what water justice means too, is to hold each other with deep care for each other. And deep friendships have come up from this work for that reason, like deep familial friendships that are not just about the work, but also about caring for each other.
Something I'm really curious about is your background. So, what is your background that laid the foundation for working in water justice?
Thank you so much for that question, Maya. That's a super sweet question. So for me, it all began really, I am a ceremonialist. I am a tradition keeping steward from the Caribbean, from Puerto Rico. And I work across the islands in the Caribbean with people on recovering our water stewardship practices, our land stewardship practices. But in particular, my emphasis is water and how it is a sacred component of both our indigenous practices in the Caribbean and Black practices, ceremonial practices in the Caribbean and values in the Caribbean. So for me, that was essential for the beginning of this work, is feeling that I have this deep sacred understanding of water from both my indigenous and Black ancestors from Puerto Rico, from Boriquén. And so how can I put that to the service of communities here where I'm a guest, right? In Kalapujilihi, in Oregon, in a place where I wasn't born or raised, but I'm here. And so how can I connect them with people who have the same kind of commitment to water, coming from communities that were built through this solidarity between people indigenous to the Caribbean and people indigenous to West Africa who were forcibly removed from their homelands, having to leave all their ecological resources behind, many of them, but still keeping that knowledge, right? And coming from communities that were born out of that kind of kinship, solidarity across difference, right? Of like welcoming these people who were forced to be brought to the Caribbean in horrible conditions, horrible, facing enslavement together, facing genocide together, colonization together, and still surviving because they all shared that ecological knowledge, their food resources, how you care for water and land together in this place in Puerto Rico, right? And still maintain that today because, right, like our families keep all those traditions alive today in spite of so many attempts to quash them. For me, I do believe that coming from a place where my indigenous and Black ancestors found ways to work with each other and survive together inspires me to say, we can work across difference in water. Our peoples have already done it. Here we are. And so for me, they're the ones who keep me inspired and motivated to do the work. And especially consider that in my hometown back home, we have some serious water challenges where we have high cancer rates in town because we have an industrial park that was built. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, pharmaceuticals, Hanes used to be there too, all right next to our main water source, right? My mom used to say, do not drink the water from the faucet. She will always filter it, right? I had friends in childhood with cancer in our community. We suspect, and we're going to prove this very soon, the water and the air are culprits of what that happened. And so for me, coming from that context of that awareness that maybe sometimes you don't trust the water in the faucet, and this is why, right? Like then I come here and I can hear the stories, and they also make sense to me because I understand what that looks like. I'm coming from a place where my mom has a memory of picking water from the spring that her family has stewarded for generations, right? Carrying it to the house, the effort of carrying it in a bucket all the way to her house. That in one generation, her experience and mine are so distinct, right? She could trust her water back then, but I couldn't, right? So for me, all of that is really formative for how we do the work and how we can hear to such a diversity of stories. Because I've seen it even in my small hometown, how in one generation, we actually have diverse experiences with water too.
Well, the people of Oregon are very lucky to have you as part of this effort to address water issues and deliver justice. Such an incredible amount of knowledge and perspective. Thank you for sharing it with us, and we're glad we can share it with the audience.
Thank you all for having me.
Alai,
It's been
thank you
lovely.
so much.
Thank you both, Travis and Maya. It's been lovely.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. The series Color of Water is a collaboration between Waterloop and the Water Hub. To find all episodes, sign up for email updates, and connect on social media, visit waterloop.org.
Waterloop, Waterloop, Waterloop.